The chandeliers of the Hale Grand Hotel glittered like captured constellations, casting warm light over a sea of tuxedos and gowns. At the edge of that world moved Ava Carter, balancing a polished tray of champagne flutes with the careful grace of someone who could not afford a single mistake. The uniform on her back was rented dignity, the extra shift a necessity to keep overdue bills from swallowing her family whole. From her vantage point near the marble pillars, Ava watched power drift past in waves. Bankers, surgeons, donors, board members, all laughing as if nothing in the world could touch them. She expected to feel invisible among them, but there was one pair of eyes that refused to treat her as background. Mason Hale. To the guests, he was the billionaire heir, the owner of the very hotel whose crystal towers framed the skyline. To Ava, he was also the quiet man who sat at the corner stool of a small diner 3 mornings a week, drinking black coffee and listening more than he spoke. In that different world, he tipped generously and always remembered to ask how her sister Mia was doing at school. Tonight he wore a tailored dark suit that turned every glance his way. Yet when their eyes met across the ballroom, the corners of his mouth lifted in the smallest private smile. A secret thread tugged between them, a brief reminder that beneath this glittering stage, he was still the same man who folded his own napkin and thanked her for refilling his cup. The thread snapped a heartbeat later. Veronica Hale cut through the crowd with a precision that made people step aside without realizing it. Her posture was flawless, her expression carved from ice. Beside her moved Edmund Hale in a sleek motorized chair, his face carved with age and history, his pale eyes missing nothing. Ava saw Veronica lean in, her voice low and sharp as she gestured toward a young socialite at the far table. A candidate, a match, an arrangement. Mason's shoulders stiffened. For a moment, he looked like a man on a ledge with no safe way down. Then his gaze searched the room and found Ava again. The quiet plea in his eyes stole the air from her lungs. He began to move. Across the polished floor he walked with long, decisive strides, cutting through clusters of guests without pause. Before Ava could step back, his hand closed around hers, warm and firm and a little too tight. He did not apologize. He did not explain. He simply murmured a brief instruction pitched too low for anyone else to hear and steered her toward a side corridor lined with catering doors. One door stood ajar. He pulled it open and guided her inside. The utility room swallowed them in darkness as the door clicked shut. Shelving loomed around them, the scent of starch and metal and stored linens thick in the air. Ava felt the solid wall against her spine and the solid weight of Mason close in front of her, his breath uneven, his pulse a wild drum she could sense more than hear. Footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Veronica called his name, each syllable sharp enough to cut. Mason stood motionless, listening, his hands still wrapped around Ava's. For a few suspended seconds, they shared one narrow pocket of air while the world prowled just beyond the door. Then the footsteps faded. The danger did not. The door flung open in a blaze of light and music. Mason stepped forward, pulling Ava with him out into the corridor and straight into the path of Veronica and Edmund. Conversations in the nearest room began to dim as heads turned. In that charged instant, Mason made his choice. He lifted his hands to Ava's face, his touch steady now, his jaw set with a resolve that looked almost reckless. Before she could find words, he closed the distance between them and kissed her, slow and deliberate, in full view of his family and the glittering crowd beyond. Time fractured, her world tilted, and in a single breath Ava Carter crossed an invisible border from anonymous waitress into something far more dangerous. Rain slicked the pavement outside Ava Carter's apartment building, turning the streetlights into long, trembling streaks of gold. She hurried up the worn steps, her hands still faintly shaking from the chaos of the gala. The echo of the kiss clung to her like static. She had no explanation for it and no right to want one. Men like Mason Hale did not kiss women like her for reasons that made sense. Tonight had been a collision, nothing more. She fumbled with her keys and pushed open the door. The apartment greeted her with its familiar mix of cramped warmth and quiet struggle. A stack of medical bills lay on the kitchen counter. Mia's textbooks were spread across the sofa. A single lamp glowed dimly, its shade slightly crooked. Home. Imperfect. Barely held together. The only place that felt real. She had taken 2 steps inside when a shadow detached itself from the window. Ava froze. Mason stood in her living room as if he belonged there, rainwater clinging to his coat, his hair damp and falling slightly out of place. For the first time in all the months she had seen him at the diner, he looked undone. Not the billionaire heir, not the man with endless poise, just a human being standing too still, as if afraid any movement might shatter what little control he had left. Ava set her bag down slowly. "What are you doing here?" He did not waste a second. "I need your help." Those 4 words landed heavier than the kiss. Mason reached into his coat and set a sealed folder on the table. His jaw tightened before he spoke again. "My grandfather's inheritance is bound by a stability clause. If I cannot prove I am in a committed relationship, the board shifts control to Veronica. She will dismantle everything my father built." Ava blinked, unsure whether to laugh or run. "And what does that have to do with me?" Mason opened the folder. Inside lay a clean, precise document, a contract, her name printed neatly above a blank signature line. "Because you were the only real choice tonight, and because I need someone the board cannot dismiss as a performance. Someone they saw me reach for without hesitation." Ava's pulse thudded in her ears. "You want me to pretend to be your girlfriend?" His answer was steady. "For 6 months. In exchange, I will cover your family's medical debts and your sister's school fees, and you will receive $1 million when the arrangement ends." The number struck her like a blow. 1 million. Enough to change everything. Enough to give Mia a life where she did not need inhalers hidden in every bag. Enough to free her mother from double shifts. Enough to let Ava breathe for the first time in years. She forced herself to look at the contract, scanning the lines with trembling eyes. Her gaze stopped at one clause, printed in stark, bold type. Clause 7. Emotional prohibition. The client and the partner will not express declarations of love during the duration of this agreement. Violation nullifies the contract. Ava raised her eyes. "You actually wrote this?" Mason did not flinch. "I need this to remain practical. Clean. Contained. Contained. As if emotions were a chemical spill to be avoided." Ava closed the folder. "I cannot sign something like this." Before he could answer, her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up and heard Mia's small, trembling voice. The school's office had called. Tuition was past due. She would lose her place in the gifted arts program if payment was not made by morning. Ava's breath splintered. She looked at the bills, at the thin walls, at the future closing around them. Then she looked at Mason. Her hand moved before her doubt could catch it. She picked up the pen, signed her name. When she finished, Mason exhaled, a sound equal parts relief and regret. The contract was sealed, and the forbidden rule was now a quiet blade waiting in the dark. The Hale estate rose over the hillside like a monument carved from old power and older money. Columns framed the grand entrance, and lanterns flickered along the stone path, casting warm pools of light on polished steps. Ava Carter smoothed the skirt of her borrowed dress while Mason waited beside her, his expression unreadable. The car had barely rolled to a stop when the front doors opened. Staff lined the foyer in a perfectly orchestrated reception. At the far end stood Veronica Hale, her posture as rigid as the marble floors beneath them. Edmund Hale followed in his motorized chair, his gaze sharp despite his fragile frame. Ava felt instantly out of place. Her dress fit, but nothing about her felt like it belonged in a world where dinner conversations could shift markets, and where a single raised eyebrow from Veronica could send a boardroom scrambling. Mason placed a steadying hand at her back. Ready, she was not, but she nodded. The dining room looked like something from a museum, long and formidable, with an antique chandelier spilling golden light over polished silverware. Each seat had been arranged with ceremonial precision. A servant pulled out Ava's chair beside Mason, while Veronica sat opposite, a queen settling in to assess a potential threat. As soon as the wine was poured, the interrogation began. Veronica's smile never faltered, but each question cut close to the bone. Where did you grow up, Ava? What does your family do? Are you pursuing higher education? What are your long-term ambitions? Each inquiry seemed designed not to understand, but to expose. Ava answered with composed honesty, while her fingers tightened around her napkin beneath the table. She could feel Veronica measuring every syllable, searching for cracks in the story, for inconsistencies she could weaponize. Mason remained calm, yet Ava sensed the controlled tension beneath his stillness. Every time Veronica tilted toward cruelty, his gaze flicked to Ava with a silent apology. For him, this dinner was an evaluation. For her, it felt like standing on trial. A lull settled over the table. Then Veronica struck again. Ava, dear, I hear you enjoy the opera. You must join us next week for La Traviata. I would love to hear your thoughts on Violetta's final aria. Ava froze. She had never been to an opera in her life. Mason knew it. Veronica knew it. This was not a question. It was a trap. Before the silence could humiliate her, Mason leaned forward. Ava prefers jazz. We spent a beautiful evening at Blue Lantern listening to Marcy Vaughn perform. The last show she did before her residency ended. The lie was seamless. The confidence in his voice turned it into truth. Ava glanced at him and found a flicker of something in his eyes, not calculation, but protectiveness. Edmund exhaled a quiet sound that might have been a laugh. It was barely perceptible, but it shifted the air in the room. Veronica's smile thinned. Jazz. How unexpected. Dinner continued with a little less venom, though the undercurrent of tension remained. By the time plates were cleared, Ava felt drained yet strangely steady. She had survived the first test. More importantly, she had seen a side of Mason few people ever witnessed. As they prepared to leave, Edmund called out softly, "Ava." A moment. She paused beside his chair. His voice was low but sure. Strength does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives at a table full of wolves and refuses to bow. Ava blinked, startled by the unexpected kindness. When she stepped back outside into the cool night air, she felt the shift inside her. She had walked into the Hale estate as a prop in Mason's performance. She walked out feeling like something far more dangerous. The woman his family had underestimated. The woman who might change everything. Ava Carter stood in the doorway of her small apartment, cardboard boxes stacked at her feet, the familiar scent of detergent and old books clinging to the air. The decision to move into Mason Hale's penthouse had been made on paper the moment she signed the contract. But the emotional weight of packing her life into boxes felt far heavier than ink and clauses. Mason arrived exactly when he said he would. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, confident yet quieter than usual, as if he understood he was entering sacred territory. He paused at the threshold, taking in the cramped living room, the sketchbooks scattered across the coffee table, the photos of Ava's mother holding Mia with a smile that had cost her too much strength. "This is you," he murmured, not dismissively, but with a softness she had not expected. Ava lifted one of the boxes and forced a small smile. This was me. They worked in an unspoken rhythm, Mason handing her tape while she folded clothes, Ava labeling boxes while he carried others to the elevator. The space emptied slowly, piece by piece, until the walls felt stripped of their warmth. When she finally removed the last drawing thumbtacked beside her bed, the room felt hollow. So did something inside her. Mason lingered near the window, his gaze drifting to her collection of sketches. "You drew these?" Ava hesitated. "They are nothing serious." He picked up a portrait of Mia, laughing with her hair whipped by the wind. His voice grew quieter. "These are pieces of a future. Do not diminish them." Before she could answer, the apartment door swung open, and Mia barreled inside, her backpack bouncing against her shoulder. "Ava, you are packing everything." Ava crouched to hug her sister. "We are moving for a little while, somewhere safer, somewhere with space for you to breathe." Mia grinned, ready to ask a dozen questions when her smile faltered. She clutched her chest, the color draining from her cheeks. Ava saw the warning signs instantly. Mason inhaler, bag, blue pouch. Now Mason moved before the words were fully out. He snatched the backpack, rifled through pockets, searching with frantic precision. But there was no inhaler. Mia's breaths turned sharp and thin, her small fingers trembling as she tried to stay upright. Ava felt the room spin. "Hospital, we have to go now." Mason scooped Mia into his arms without hesitation. His voice shifted into a tone Ava had never heard before. All command and no fear. "Stay close." Down the stairs, across the hallway, into the car. The world blurred into streaks of gray and red as Mason drove with ruthless focus, slicing through traffic, one hand steadying Mia against his chest, while the other gripped the wheel. Ava kept whispering Mia's name, every breath a prayer. Mason ignored honking cars and lights changing yellow, his jaw locked as if he were daring the city itself to get in his way. At the emergency entrance, he did not wait for help. He carried Mia through the sliding doors and demanded attention with a voice that brooked no refusal. Nurses moved instantly. A doctor appeared. A mask was fitted to Mia's face. Oxygen hissed. Color slowly seeped back into her cheeks. Her breathing steadied. Ava collapsed into a chair, tears burning behind her eyes. Mason sat beside her, elbows on his knees, head bowed, chest rising and falling with the aftershock of fear. Minutes passed before he lifted his gaze. Their eyes locked. Something unspoken moved between them, something deeper than obligation or contract terms. She whispered, "Thank you." Mason shook his head. "I would do it again, every time." In that quiet hospital room, Ava felt the axis of their arrangement shift. She had agreed to be pretend for him, but nothing about tonight had been pretend. The night of the charity ball unfolded like a dream wrapped in silk and candlelight. Mason Hale's penthouse driver escorted Ava to the event in a sleek black car, but the vehicle's luxury paled beside the weight settling in her chest. She wore a midnight blue gown chosen by a stylist Mason insisted on hiring, its satin fabric pooling like water around her feet when she stepped out. For the first time in her life, heads turned not because she was serving drinks, but because she was stepping into a world that was never meant to include her. Mason waited for her near the entrance to the ballroom. The moment he saw her, he stopped speaking mid-sentence to some board member and simply stared. For a heartbeat, the gala's music faded, and the entire world shrank to a column of warm light framing him, and the quiet awe softening his features. Ava felt her pulse flutter as he approached. "You look remarkable," he said, his voice almost reverent. "You chose the dress," she replied. "I chose the color. You turned it into something unforgettable." He offered his arm. She took it, feeling the subtle tension beneath his calm exterior. Together, they entered the room. The ball was a swirl of elegance. Crystal glasses chimed. Laughter rippled under the soft glow of chandeliers. A famous quartet played near the raised stage, their instruments weaving silver notes through the air. Everywhere Ava looked, she saw the Hale name etched into banners, brochures, donation plaques. The event raised funds for the hospital where Mia had been treated the night Mason saved her. Guests approached them with smiles, carefully polished for social display. Some congratulated Mason on his dedication to charity. Others eyed Ava with curiosity, admiration, or thinly veiled skepticism. She responded with poise, remembering Veronica's interrogation and Edmund's small encouragement. Tonight, she would not bow. As the opening speeches ended, Mason guided her onto the dance floor. The first chords of a waltz drifted through the room. Ava stiffened. "I do not know how to dance like this." Mason drew her closer. "Then, follow me." His hand found the curve of her waist. Their steps aligned, tentative at first, then fluent as he subtly guided her across the polished floor. The crowd blurred into soft color. There was only the warmth of his palm, the rhythm of their movement, the quiet promise in the way he watched her, as though she were the steady point in a spinning room. A soft laugh escaped her when she nearly stumbled. Mason steadied her instantly. "You are doing perfectly." Their eyes locked. The air changed. Uneasy familiarity deepened into something neither of them could pretend away. When the music slowed, his forehead brushed hers, their breaths mingling. The world faded until there was nothing but the thrum of possibility. Mason stepped back first, as if the moment had startled him. "Come," he murmured. He led her through a side door onto a moonlit terrace overlooking the city. Cool night air washed over them, and the distant hum of traffic rose from below like a lullaby. The moon, round and bright, cast a silver glow that softened every sharp line of doubt inside her. Ava turned toward Mason and found him watching her with a quiet intensity she had never seen before. No tension, no armor, just truth. He stepped closer. "I do not know what is happening to me," he admitted. Neither did she. And yet the answer rose between them with effortless clarity. He framed her face with both hands, his touch warm and certain. Under the moonlight and the hush of the terrace, he kissed her. It was not a performance, not a tactic, not a necessity. It was slow, searching, alive with emotion he had spent years locking away. Ava felt something inside her tilt toward a dangerous edge. She opened her mouth to speak, the words poised on her tongue. Mason went rigid. His hand moved to her lips, gently stopping the sentence before it was born. "Do not say it," he whispered. "Not tonight." The forbidden rule loomed like a shadow between them, but the kiss lingered in the air, trembling with the confession they both almost made. The private gallery reception was supposed to be simple, an evening of curated charm where Mason Hale would impress a potential investor, while Ava stood at his side, poised and supportive. Yet for her, it felt like stepping into a dream with sharp edges. The gallery glowed with soft white lighting that made every painting look like it held a secret. Guests drifted from canvas to canvas, murmuring philosophical judgments about brushstrokes and symbolism. For once, Ava belonged in a room like this, because here art was the language, and she spoke it fluently. She wore a soft cream dress that Mason insisted suited her better than anything in his world of glamour. It contrasted beautifully against the charcoal sketches she carried in a slim leather portfolio, her precious collection of the best work she had created over years of quiet dedication. Mason had encouraged her to bring it, hoping she would show it to the curator he knew would appreciate her talent. Throughout the evening, she felt something unfamiliar inside herself, a sense of grounded confidence. When people asked her thoughts on the installations, she answered with clarity and passion. When Mason watched her from across the room, she saw pride in his eyes, real pride, not the polished expression he reserved for business associates. As she stood studying a large, abstract piece, the curator approached a silver-haired woman whose warm eyes sparkled with genuine curiosity. They spoke about color theory, about negative space, about meaning. Finally, the curator smiled. "I would love to see your personal work sometime." Ava's heart lifted. She turned to retrieve her portfolio from a nearby table, and that was when she heard the smooth, icy voice that had haunted her since the night of the family dinner. "You clean up well, dear." Veronica Hale glided toward her, holding a glass of red wine, her expression a perfect mask of social grace sharpened by contempt. She moved like a predator disguised in silk. Ava kept her voice steady. "I am not ashamed of my past or my job." "Of course not," Veronica purred. "It takes ambition to jump from serving coffee to inhabiting a penthouse." She circled Ava like an elegant vulture, offering hollow compliments and subtle cuts that sliced deeper than any open insult. Each comment was designed to unravel her, to make her forget that she belonged here. But Ava did not break. She kept her chin high, focusing on the curator's warm smile. She reached for her portfolio. And that was when Veronica stumbled, a graceful calculated motion, her wine glass tipping forward in slow motion. The dark liquid spilled like a falling curtain, splashing across the leather case. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Veronica clutched her chest dramatically. "Oh dear, I am so terribly sorry." Ava froze. Her fingers trembled as she unlatched the case. Inside, her sketches were ruined. Charcoal strokes melted into crimson smears. Faces distorted, memories destroyed. A soft cry escaped her, raw and involuntary. The room blurred. She did not see Mason approaching. She only felt the sudden shift in the air when he arrived beside her. His expression went cold, impossibly cold. The fury in his eyes was glacial and absolute. "Veronica," he said quietly, but with lethal precision, "you have crossed a line from which there is no return." His aunt paled. He turned his back on her without another glance and knelt beside Ava, closing the ruined portfolio with gentle hands. "Let us go home," he said, his voice low with compassion. For the first time that night, Ava let herself fall apart. And for the first time, Mason did not try to fix the world around her. He simply stayed at her side. The penthouse was silent when they returned, a cavernous world of glass and stone that seemed to swallow sound whole. Ava walked inside as if moving underwater, numb, exhausted, her arms wrapped protectively around the ruined portfolio. She placed it gently on the white marble coffee table and stared at it as if looking at a fallen body. Then the dam inside her finally burst. She sank onto the sofa, her shoulders shaking, her breath breaking into jagged pieces. The sobs came hard and fast, raw and unfiltered grief for every hour she had poured into those sketches, for every piece of herself she had tried to put into the world, only to watch it be destroyed in a single, calculated moment. "I only had this," she choked out, her face buried in her palms. "It was mine." Mason stood several feet away, his expression tight with helplessness. He had faced hostile boards, ruthless competitors, and billion-dollar crises, but none of it had prepared him for this. The sight of Ava crumbling in front of him, and knowing he could not undo what had been done. He moved to the window, his chest rising and falling in uneven breaths as he fought the instinct to fix the unfixable. Minutes passed, slow and heavy, until her sobs quieted into small, trembling exhales. When he finally turned back to her, something in his face had changed. He crossed the room silently and sat beside her, leaving a respectful inch of space, though his presence pressed against her like a steady heartbeat. He did not offer empty reassurances or apologies. He simply sat with her, letting her grief exist without rushing it. After a long, quiet stretch, he rose without a word and disappeared down the dim hallway. Ava wiped her face, confused, watching the shadows swallow him. When he returned, he carried something carefully in his hands. An old leather-bound sketchbook, its edges worn, its brown cover softened by years of touch. 2 faded gold initials were stamped on the front, D.H. He sat beside her again and placed the book gently in her lap. She looked at it, then at him, her brows furrowed in fragile confusion. "It belonged to my father," Mason said, his voice low, steady, threaded with a depth she had never heard from him. He was not meant to be a corporate titan. He was an architect first, an artist by heart. He sketched constantly, lines and shapes and people, anything that caught his eye. Ava opened the cover with trembling fingers. Inside were architectural sketches, flowing lines, elegant structures, hands captured in motion, quiet portraits of strangers. Beauty lived on every page. "He gave it to me when I was a teenager." Mason continued his gaze, fixed on the book, not her. "He told me that buildings and companies and fortunes crumble, but art that comes from the soul is indestructible." Ava's throat tightened. Mason finally looked at her, his expression stripped of every mask, every layer of control. "Your soul was not stained tonight, Ava. Only the paper." His hand nudged the sketchbook closer to her. "Start again," he said softly. "Use this. Use my father's pages until you fill your own." Her breath hitched. "I will make the time," he added. "I will clear my schedule, cancel meetings, rearrange everything. I want you to create. I want you to breathe again. I believe in you." The words struck her like light breaking through storm clouds. In her lap lay not just a sketchbook, but a piece of his history, a piece of his heart, the most intimate thing he had ever given anyone. And in that moment, surrounded by silence and the faint scent of sandalwood, Ava felt something rise inside her, powerful, terrifying, beautiful, a truth she could not speak. The Legacy cut across the open sea like a silent cathedral of wealth, its polished mahogany decks gleaming beneath the late afternoon sun. For Ava, the yacht was breathtaking, but suffocating, a floating kingdom built for power games and quiet wars. Arthur Hale had summoned them all for a family weekend, a gesture framed as bonding, but understood by everyone as a final assessment of his heirs. It was a summons, not a choice. Ava stepped aboard with her heart held tightly in her chest. Veronica greeted her with a smile as thin as a razor and twice as sharp. Every movement, every word was a test wrapped in civility. Mason stayed close, but the tension in him radiated like heat, his shoulder brushing hers whenever the yacht tilted, as if by instinct he knew when she needed steadiness. The first day unfolded like a silent play. Meals eaten beneath chandeliers that swayed gently with the waves. Conversations laced with hidden blades. Arthur observing from his wheelchair with eyes that saw through silk and steel alike. Ava felt as if she were being weighed and measured in every breath she took. The grand staterooms, the meticulous meals, the endless ocean, nothing eased the pressure. But at night, when the wind softened and the sky turned into a canvas of starlight, the yacht changed. It became a quiet place, a sanctuary carved from loneliness. Ava found herself standing at the stern, staring out at the dark water while the sky glittered above her like 1,000 forgotten wishes. The ocean smelled of salt and possibility. Mason joined her without a word, standing a careful foot away, leaning on the metal railing that hummed softly beneath their hands. The sea breeze lifted a strand of her hair, and he reached out on instinct, tucking it gently behind her ear. The touch was fleeting, but electric. "I used to come out here with my father," he said, his voice low, a deep rumble carried by the wind. "He taught me the constellations, said nights like these were reminders that men are small and their empires even smaller." Ava turned to him. He looked different in the starlight, less like a man built of edges and control, more like someone who carried grief gently beneath his ribs. She saw not a billionaire or heir, but the boy he had once been, the boy who missed his father fiercely. "Your father sounds like he was extraordinary," Ava said softly. "He was," Mason replied, and for a moment his voice cracked, a fragile fracture revealing a truth he rarely shared. Then he looked at her fully, his eyes dark and earnest. "He would have liked you. He would have seen your clarity right away." Her heart clenched. The sincerity in his voice wrapped around her like a warm ache. He hesitated, then took a small step closer, shrinking the space between them to nothing but breath and truth. "When I am with you," he began, and then stopped the words, trembling on the edge of his mouth. Ava waited, the world holding perfectly still. "I feel like I can," he tried again, then faltered, closing his eyes in frustration. The unfinished sentence hovered between them, shimmering with everything he could not yet admit. She realized then that the rule he had imposed on her was a reflection of chains he wore himself. He was as bound as she was, perhaps more so, haunted by fears she did not yet understand. He looked away, and the moment shattered. The connection dimmed like a candle flickering in the wind. Ava stepped back, the hurt quiet but sharp. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the cabin, the stars blurring in her eyes. Behind her, Mason remained at the railing, hands gripping the cold metal as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. The waves roared below him, and the words he had swallowed echoed in his chest, aching for release. 2 days after the yacht returned to the harbor, the Hale mansion transformed from a house of wealth into a chamber of reckoning. The air inside felt colder, heavier, as if the walls themselves sensed the approaching end of an era. Arthur Hale's health had plummeted with terrifying speed, and now the family gathered in his study, a room drenched in old mahogany and older expectations. Ava stood behind Mason's chair, her hand resting lightly on its back. The gesture was small, yet grounding, a silent promise of presence as the room filled with tension. Mason sat, rigid, jaw set, eyes forward, holding himself like a man preparing for battle. The family lawyers lined the far wall, holding thick folders, sealed documents, and clipped pens. They were keepers of fate, waiting for the patriarch's final decree. Veronica arrived last, dressed in severe black. Her expression, a polished mask of grief and ambition. She carried a thick dossier, which she placed deliberately on Arthur's desk, as if presenting evidence at a trial. When she began to speak, her voice was smooth and venomous. She listed every mistake Mason had ever made, every youthful misstep inflated into damning proof, every risk he had taken painted as recklessness. She spoke of stability as if she embodied it, of leadership as if it were her birthright. The words cut through the dim room with cold precision, and Ava felt Mason tense under the weight of each accusation. Veronica ended with a dagger delivered sweetly. The Hale legacy requires a steady hand, not a man still trying to find himself. When Mason rose to speak, he did not defend his past. He spoke instead of the future. He talked about innovation, integrity, responsibility to employees and communities. He spoke with a steady fire that filled the room, a warmth that contrasted sharply with Veronica's ice. Ava's throat tightened with pride. It was the first time she had seen him fully step into the man he had always been beneath the armor. Then Arthur lifted a trembling hand and the room fell silent. His voice was harshened by age, but still sharp as iron. Enough. He ignored Veronica. He ignored the lawyers. He turned his pale, piercing eyes directly to Ava. "Girl, one question." A hush fell over the world. "Do you love my grandson?" A single sentence detonated everything. Ava's heart slammed against her ribs. Mason gasped so softly she barely heard it. Veronica froze mid-breath, eyes wide with predatory anticipation. Ava understood instantly. This was not simply a question. It was a trap built with ruthless brilliance. If she said yes, she broke the contract, shattered Mason's fragile trust, reinforced every fear he carried, and confirmed in Arthur's eyes that the relationship was a performance bought and staged. If she said no, she destroyed Mason's claim, undermined his stability, gave Veronica victory, and tore apart everything they had fought to build. Her pulse roared in her ears, but she held Arthur's gaze steady. He was not asking for romance. He was measuring her soul. Her voice, when it finally came, was steady, even as emotion coiled tight in her chest. "What I feel for your grandson is not a word that can be offered to win an argument or satisfy a clause in a will. Feelings are complicated. Actions are simple." She spoke of Mason's strength unseen by the world, his kindness when no one watched, his quiet integrity. She told Arthur that she chose to stand beside him, not for his title, but for his character, not for the empire he might inherit, but for the man he already was. When she finally turned to Mason, her eyes were filled with unwavering devotion. "That choice," she finished, "is more important than any 3 words I could say." Silence held the world still. Then Arthur smiled. It was small, but real, and filled with profound approval. "That," he rasped, "is the answer of a Hale." He turned to the lawyers. "The chairmanship goes to Mason." Veronica's breath shattered into a gasp of disbelief. Mason sat stunned, eyes fixed on Ava in reverent awe. But as the room erupted into frantic motion and legal declarations, Ava felt something inside her quietly fracture. She had helped him win an empire, but she had done it bound by a rule that kept her truth locked behind her ribs. And victory had never felt so much like loss. The days that followed felt suspended in a muted gray haze, as if time itself were holding its breath. The victory that should have ignited celebration instead settled over the Hale estate like a thin layer of dust. Mason was buried in meetings, transition plans, legal briefings, and endless condolences for a dying patriarch whose legacy he was now sworn to protect. Ava drifted through the penthouse as a quiet ghost living in a world that had never been hers. She found herself standing often in the small art studio Mason had created for her, the one room that felt like a heartbeat inside the cold perfection of his home. Canvases leaned against the walls, untouched. Tubes of paint lay neatly arranged, waiting for her hands. The sketchbook from Mason's father rested on the table, open to a blank page. It was a gift more intimate than any confession. Yet the silence between them had grown so wide she no longer knew how to cross it. Every night Mason returned later and more exhausted, carrying the weight of an empire on his shoulders. He kissed her forehead with gentle, distant affection and rested his hand on her back as though apologizing for each hour he could not give her. But the rule remained between them like an invisible barricade. She could not speak the truth, swelling painfully inside her, and he could not bring himself to tear down the walls he had built long before she entered his life. She had saved him from losing his birthright. She had become the anchor that steadied him in every storm. Yet she was still a woman bound by silence, in a home where even love had clauses. One night, after he had returned from another long meeting, she watched him from across the room. He looked weary, older than he truly was, as if the crown he had just inherited weighed too heavily on him. Something inside her cracked open with quiet finality. She could survive many things, but not a life where her truth was forbidden. When Mason finally fell into an exhausted sleep, Ava remained awake, sitting at his desk, beneath the soft glow of a lamp. She pulled a piece of heavy cream-colored stationery from a drawer, the same paper he had used for their contract. Her fingers trembled, but her resolve did not. She wrote slowly, carefully, each word carved from the deepest part of her heart. Mason, you have your empire now, and I am proud of the man you have become. Proud of the strength I have seen in you, but I cannot remain in a world where the truest parts of me must stay silent. I cannot be the person you need while bound by a rule that forbids honesty. This is not goodbye out of anger, but out of necessity. You deserve a partner unencumbered by fear, and I deserve a life where I am not muted. Thank you for everything, Ava. She folded the note into a neat rectangle and placed it on the center of his immaculate bed, a small, pale truth resting against a sea of gray fabric. Then she packed only what mattered, a few clothes, her wallet, and the worn leather sketchbook that had belonged to his father. The rest of his world did not belong to her, and she would not take anything that felt borrowed. As she stepped out of the penthouse for the last time, the door closed behind her with a soft, decisive click. The sound echoed down the hallway and through her chest like the breaking of something fragile. Something she wished she could have saved. She did not look back. Dawn crept into the penthouse with a pale gold softness that belied the devastation waiting inside. Mason woke with a start, the kind born not from rest, but from sheer exhaustion giving way. His hand reached instinctively toward the other side of the bed, seeking the warmth he had grown used to, the steady presence that had become his quiet refuge. Instead, his fingers touched cool, untouched sheets. A strange chill fanned across his chest. "Ava?" he called out softly, then louder, the silence swallowing his voice like a vast, unlit room. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, and only then did he see it, the small envelope resting precisely where her head would have lain. His name written in her elegant script. His breath left him in a single sharp exhale. He knew. Before he touched it, before he opened it, before the paper even rustled, he knew. He read the letter once, then again. By the third time, the words blurred as grief tightened around his throat with a merciless grip. She was gone. Not because she stopped caring, but because she cared too deeply. Because he had created a world where the thing she needed most was forbidden by his own hand. Memories crashed through him all at once. Ava laughing on the beach, her hair whipping in the breeze. Ava tracing constellations beside him on the yacht with a quiet wonder that had made him believe in stars again. Ava in the hospital study, standing her ground before his grandfather with strength greater than anyone else in the room. Ava choosing him every single time, even when he had not asked her to. He had told himself the rule protected her, protected him. Protected the fragile thing between them before it could shatter. But all it had done was cage something that was meant to breathe. He pressed her letter to his chest, closing his eyes as a hollow ache echoed where his heart should have been. For the first time since inheriting the Hale Empire, he felt unmoored. All the meetings and new responsibilities, the contracts, the decisions, the empire waiting for his leadership, none of it mattered in this moment. Because the one person who had seen him, not as an heir or a billionaire or a legacy, but simply as a man, was gone. He called her phone immediately, straight to voicemail. He tried again and again until his hands shook. Then he called the driver, the staff, everyone who might have seen her. No one had. She had slipped away like fog at sunrise, carrying nothing but the bare essentials and the sketchbook he had given her. By afternoon, he had gone through every room in the penthouse, searching for some sign, some clue, some anchor. He found none, but he did find the contract tucked neatly in a drawer, where she had placed it on her first night there. He tore it in half, then into quarters, then into pieces so small they fluttered through his fingers like ash. "You fool," he whispered to the empty room, the words cracking under the weight of regret. The penthouse felt cavernous without her. Every corner echoed with her absence. The art studio was a wound. Her unfinished canvases stood like silent accusations, colors trapped mid-sentence. Her coffee mug still sat on the counter, a faint lipstick mark at the rim. He pressed his thumb against it, as though he could make her reappear. That evening, Veronica arrived unannounced, expecting victory, gloating, leverage. She took one look at his face and froze. Mason walked past her without a word, without acknowledging her triumph. Whatever schemes she had nurtured had no place in a world where Ava was missing. As night fell, Mason stood alone at the massive windows overlooking the glittering city. He had inherited an empire built from decades of ruthless brilliance and disciplined vision. But none of it meant anything without the woman who had reminded him how to feel alive. "She left because she thought she was holding me back," he murmured into the empty room. "But the truth is, I was the one holding her back." The city lights blurred as his eyes stung. Tomorrow he would begin looking for her. Every street, every gallery, every small apartment she might retreat to, every corner of a city too vast for a broken man. He would search until he found her, or until he had nothing left to give. But tonight he stood alone, surrounded by all the wealth in the world, and realized it could not fill the shape of her absence. The storm arrived without warning, turning the city into a blur of silver streaks and trembling reflections. Rain hammered the sidewalks, windows, and lampposts with relentless urgency, as if the sky itself were trying to shake two people back into the same orbit. Mason moved through it without an umbrella, without hesitation, soaked to the bone but driven by a single purpose. He had spent days searching through every place that had ever mattered to Ava, every gallery, cafe, supply shop, and quiet corner she had once described with soft affection. Her absence had carved an unbearable hollow inside him. By the fourth night, he found himself following instinct rather than logic, drawn toward the one place that had always belonged to her, long before she belonged to anyone. The little studio she used to rent above the abandoned bookshop, the one she had left when her life spun into chaos. He had gone there before, only to find it dark and lifeless. But tonight, a faint light glowed behind the rain-streaked window, soft and warm like a pulse. His heart stuttered painfully. He climbed the narrow staircase 2 steps at a time, slipping once on the wet metal grate, but catching himself before he fell. The door at the top stood slightly ajar, light spilling through the crack. He pushed it open gently, breath held tight in his chest. Ava stood in the center of the room, surrounded by canvases, some new, some old, each one a different fragment of her soul. Her back was to him, shoulders curved slightly inward as she mixed paint on a palette, the soft scrape of the brush the only sound in the quiet room. Her hair was tied loosely at the nape of her neck, a few damp strands clinging to her skin. For a moment, Mason simply watched her, the sight both breaking and healing something inside him. He stepped forward, letting the door click shut behind him. She stiffened, the brush pausing mid-air. "Ava," he said her name, almost a prayer. She turned slowly, eyes wide and startled, the paintbrush trembling in her hand. Mason stood soaked from the storm, chest heaving, breathless and undone. He looked nothing like the polished air the world admired, and everything like a man who had crossed a city to reclaim the missing piece of his life. "You should not be here," she whispered, not with anger, but with a fragile kind of fear. "I should be nowhere else," he answered, stepping closer. Her eyes glistened, panic and longing warring inside them. Mason lifted a hand, but hesitated. Inches from her cheek, a silent plea wrapped in restraint. "Ava, I was wrong. The rule, the distance, the fear, it was all me. I built walls and asked you to live inside them. I punished you for feelings I never had the courage to face. Every part of that contract, every boundary was a shield because I was terrified of losing someone the way I lost my father." Tears spilled softly down her face. Mason closed the final step between them, cupping her cheeks gently as though holding something breakable and irreplaceable. "I love you," he said, voice unsteady with truth. "Not as an heir, not as a Hale, not as a man terrified of repeating history. I love you as myself. And if you walk away now, I will still love you tomorrow, next year, and every day after. But I am begging you, do not make me spend the rest of my life searching for you in empty rooms." Ava's breath hitched, her hands rising to clutch his wrists as if anchoring herself. "I did not leave because I stopped loving you," she whispered. "I left because I thought you never would." His forehead met hers, a trembling exhale shared between them. "Then let me spend the rest of my life proving you wrong," he murmured. The storm raged outside, thunder rolling like a distant drum, but inside the small studio, the world held still. Ava closed her eyes, letting the walls around her soften, collapse, dissolve. When she finally leaned into him, it was not a surrender, but a homecoming. They stood in the dim glow of the single lamp, wrapped in the warmth of a second chance. Outside, the rain washed the city clean. Inside, two souls finally chose each other, without rules, without fear, without silence. It was not the end of their story, it was the beginning of their truth.